Good afternoon, folks. You're very welcome to this panel on therapeutic games here at Opticon. Uh, by way of introduction, I'll just read out the little blurb we have on this panel. When we don't know what to do next, video games can provide simple, achievable objectives when the world provides none. When we feel alone and we can find companionship and friendship and figuring out how to play through a scenario together as a group. Games, both tabletop and electronic, are a wonderful way for us to find escape when the world does not have a manual, provides no waypoint, and won't even give us a castle to head to. So we're here to discuss the mental health benefits of gaming. I'd like to introduce our panel. We'll start with Sam.
Hello, yeah, I'm Samuel Poots. I'm a writer based up in Northern Ireland. I've done a bit of writing for tabletop games. Most particularly, you can find a scene of mine in the Jim Henson's Labyrinth adventure game and in the Dungeons and Dragons magazine Mag of Holding, currently on Kickstarter. And I used to be content manager for the website On Tabletop, where I did some writing on this subject.
Very good, thank you. And over to you, Marc.
How he's doing? I'm Marc McCluskey. I'm Senior Library Assistant in Blanchardstown Library. I've been working in public libraries for just about 15 years. For the last 2 years, I've been running sensory-friendly introductory sessions to Dungeons and Dragons for children and adults. We've had over 200 people come through in the last 2 years and learn how to play the game and the benefits of it. Recently finished a dissertation on the added value tabletop games can add to public library events, and the secondary research in that focused on the social and therapeutic benefits of tabletop gaming.
Excellent, thank you very much. And finally, we have Quinn.
Hello, I am Quinn Clancy. I'm a member of Cup on Fay writing group. We obviously have our 6th anthology launching this year, and I'm not only autistic but casual gamer. So I am the person everybody directs all of this wonderful attention to.
Thank you very much, folks. So I suppose the initial starting point we have here is everyone plays games. It's a totally acceptable pastime now. I grew up in the 80s. It was very much not an acceptable pastime at all back then. So it's wonderful to have seen that change. Why is it that, I suppose, why do we play so much games now, do we think? Is it the horrible realities of the world we need to escape, or is it we just enjoy this sort of activity? Is it a bit of both, maybe? We'll start with you, Sam.
Well, for me personally, particularly tabletop games, I used to be a big video gamer, but I don't really have as much time for it these days. Tabletop games I found are the perfect escapism for me. I DM a lot of games, and for me that's something creative. I feel like I'm making something for my friends without the pressure that I put myself under for my professional writing. So I still get all the joy of creation and of exploring these other worlds and these different characters without that huge amounts of pressure that you face when you're writing to a deadline or to a specific audience.
And do you find you panic less then about having to put on a show for your friends rather than, oh God, there's real people out there reading what I've done?
Yeah, there is definitely an element of that because my friends obviously are not real people. So
No. They never are.
no, but one of the great joys of it is I get to see their reactions as well to the characters, and I find myself replaying character interactions and moments that really brought them joy and brought me joy. There's one character whose attempt to open a door I have replayed over and over whenever I'm on a long car journey or something like that.
It's such a wonderful mundane thing, but that it can turn into such an ordeal. Yeah. There's so much to be said for it. Yeah. And how's about you, Marc? What did you sort of get into gaming for, and how do you find it day to day as a coping mechanism for the world, or just as some way to find fun?
It's that step removed that Samuel was talking about, where it's not real life, but you invest in it as if it is. It's as important to me that I get my crops watered in Stardew Valley as it is that I pick up the children from school. And and with tabletop gaming, it's the improvisational social element of it, the yes anding, where I had a game yesterday that was supposed to be just a bloodbath. We had Splattermania there on Saturday, and it was supposed to be 20 people killing each other. What it ended up was completely cooperative, off the wall, broke the fourth wall, as the best games always do. Went completely off course, ignored any semblance of a plot, and was just incredible fun. And that's what it's for. It brings you things. And again, that step removed means there's no risk involved in it except maybe your dignity.
Yeah, this is no plan survives a encounter with the party, so to speak. I didn't get a chance to watch the Splattermania stuff yet, but yeah, I was hovering on joining in, but it looked like a lot of fun. How's about you, Quinn? What are games for you? Are they escape? Are they joy? Are they stress?
They're definitely more escapism than anything else. They're also a moment of bonding and, having a shared experience with friends and even family. I remember my first real memory of video games was watching my dad play Tomb Raider, and we'd sit together as an entire family and we would help him solve puzzles while he controlled it. And even as I got older and new Tomb Raiders came out, I would start playing with dad, and we'd take turns with dad, and we'd solve the game together. And that, to me, that's the core of games, is the cooperative play. I mean, I know there is first-person shooters, but some of the most popular ones are actually teams. So I think the cooperation is a huge, important part.
Yeah, big time. I think I broadly agree, and I think we've all sort of said the same thing, that the cooperative element, the working with others element, is a kind of a key part of the game's experience for us. I know I've spent plenty of time playing single player games, but it's just never as much fun as when you're playing with your friends.
No,
Yeah,
I agree.
Or even strangers. One of the games I've gotten into a lot recently is Warzone, Call of Duty Warzone, which is a battle royale style game, as so many other games are now these days. I just find it a much more engaging process, knowing that digital representation I'm shooting in the face is a person. I don't know why, but maybe that speaks more for me. What about the difference then? So let's say between kind of a solo experience and a cooperative experience. Is there still some benefit to be found there in that solo experience? We'll start with you, Marc.
For sure. And then that's when I started gaming. This, again, like yourself, would have been back in the 1980s, probably sat around an Atari 2600 with like 6 or 8 of my cousins. And so it was a group experience. Going to the arcade was a group experience. Getting the home console and the early PC games was the first time that I'd experienced solo play. And it's like the fiction and non-fiction sections in the library. The difference between games that you play together and games that you play on your own. They aren't the same games. The games that I play, which I probably now spend more time playing, I'll happily put 20 hours into playing Civilization. Sitting at home.
That's a short game. Yeah, I shudder every time I open Steam. I look at Civilization. I see the many hundreds of hours that have gone in. We're into 4 digits now, so just yeah. Civ is the classic. Just one more turn, as they say, and even the game themselves, they make light of it. How's it about for you, Quinn? The solo gaming experience, is it something that you've taken benefit from, pleasure from?
On a personal level, absolutely. Sometimes there is nothing quite like having a stressful, frustrating day and then going in and playing a game by yourself, working things out and getting that dopamine pleasure of succeeding and striving forward. And also it's it's a valid form of art and storytelling. I mean, I know there has been a huge renaissance lately in storytelling, starting with Dragon Age Origins, that a lot of games are suddenly enhancing the world to have greater stories and get people engaging in them more. So, I mean, there's an element there for talking about enjoying and learning a new art form. On another side, I was actually reading a wonderful article because I did a light bit of research, which the wonderful ops team has put all my citations into the channel. If anybody wants to correct me or tell me I've gotten something wrong, you can see where I'm getting my information. On restorative play, on how video games improve player well-being after something called a need frustrating event, which is what I described of coming home frustrated after a long day and getting satisfaction in the virtual world.
That's great. Just to note, you can go to our Discord server, and that's where you will find Quinn citations. They're in the Therapeutic Games channel there. Thank you very much to the team for helping us out with that, and to Quinn for putting it all together. Thank you. Yeah, so I suppose I offered the same to you then, Sam. The single player experience versus the multiplayer one. Do you find it beneficial?
Oh, absolutely. Unlike many others, I just can't get into multiplayer video games. I've tried, especially during the pandemic, first lockdown, when all my interaction had to go through my laptop. I did have fun, going back and playing Age of Mythology with some friends online, but that's not what draws me in. I need a good story for a video game, and it's very difficult to get, at least I find, very difficult to get invested in a world story when it's telling you you're the chosen one. Please ignore those other 20 chosen ones who've just logged in. But there's also a move at the moment where tabletop games are starting to recognize the value of solo play. A lot of board games are coming out with far more of a catering towards solo play and the satisfaction of solving the puzzle of a board game. And even in role-playing games, we're seeing RPGs specifically tailored for solo play, like Colossal, that was recently kickstarted and is giving me meaningful looks from the top of my to-read shelf.
That's curious. I must say I haven't heard of Colossal. I'm definitely going to look it up. The idea of a tabletop as a solo play is interesting to me. And yeah, I've seen that trend in some of the more recent releases of board games that they do have a solo option. I suppose my own kind of point of view is it's quite enjoyable when you finish the day's work. For me, I like to load up something daft without much story that I don't need to engage my brain in an awful lot, and just hit the things in the face or dig some tunnels in Minecraft or build some. It's I think there's definitely a benefit to the of playing a game by yourself and just having your own little world for a half an hour to an hour, where nobody can hopefully bother you. I'd like to, I suppose, talk then specifically about therapeutic benefits of gaming. How can games help with therapy? What sort of therapy can games help us provide and work on? We'll start with you, Quinn, if you don't mind.
No problem. I mean, from the autistic standpoint, one of the most anecdotal things everyone talks about is social inclusivity and social anxiety. That a lot of autistic kids find it hard to interact with others. As an adult diagnosed, I will say, growing up, I always feared being left in a room with my peers, but didn't mind being involved with adults or those younger than me. So I can definitely speak to that. And having a common language in which to discuss a lot of things with friends does make life a lot easier. And in fact, there's a great article on rollingboxcars.com that talks about how RPGs are great for autistic people. They provide structured social time, an inbuilt conversation starter by being there with all the rules you need in a book that you can pick up and read at any time. in day-to-day interactions, I often feel I'm scrabbling to keep up. So having this structured interaction with other people lets me socialize without having to exhaust myself with having to constantly analyze what they say and plan my replies. I can go to an RPG game and come back feeling energized, immersing myself in my passion and socializing on my terms. Now, that was a quote by Ben Warren, and the amount to which I identify it is insane. That for me, there is something about feeling closer, more vulnerable at something like a tabletop game than I would necessarily in a quiet one-on-one at lunch with a friend. So I think there's something hugely beneficial and responsive in playing role-playing games, or indeed video games or the others. It just role-playing is the first one that I think everyone talks about as being this very social game.
And Marc, you've been running kind of sensory sensitive games in the libraries before lockdown, and you said you continued them over online when the lockdown started. Can you talk a little bit about that experience and kind of how do you set all this up?
Yeah, this started when I first came to Fingal Libraries. They got a grant from As I Am to run sensory friendly events, and asked me did I have any ideas for something that could be sensory friendly. And I had been doing in the early stages of research into Therapeutic Games because I'm a big D&D player involved with D&D Dublin, and had been doing introductory events in public spaces. And to be able to do that in a sensory friendly manner, and being sensory friendly because role-playing games are played in the theatre of the mind, they're all in the imagination. The player themselves makes it sensory friendly. I haven't had to make any adjustments to my games. Simply announcing at the start, having it on the poster, having it on the sign-up sheet that this is sensory friendly is enough in most cases for events. Now, that could vary from game to game, but for something like Dungeons and Dragons, you don't need to make adjustments to it. The player will filter what they're seeing themselves or filter what they're hearing themselves. Over Discord, of course, you have more control over that. Might have someone who's too loud, too quiet. You might need to deafen, might need to back up. And you have control over that yourself, which is good. We started having those in person, and it was just come in casually, join the game. And then we started to have organized events that were running on a weekly basis, people would sign up to, and very quickly got hit with the pandemic and had to move that online.
Yeah, it's a real shame, especially when you're just getting it going, getting it started. Yeah. That's really interesting that you simply say this is sensory friendly and everyone just sort of agrees. Okay, yeah, it's no problem. And we don't need to do anything more. Like you say, it's a tabletop, it's D&D. It there's limited kind of scope, I suppose, for sensory issues. Perhaps, and maybe I'm oversimplifying there. I apologize if that comes across that way. And then Sam, you've been you've written several articles around this sort of area of therapy in games. Why don't you talk a little bit more about kind of what you found and were there any kind of common things that came through?
Yes, well, back when I worked on Tabletop, I first wrote an article about how some teachers had started using D&D in the classroom as a way of new ways of exploring ideas in, for example, in English literature text. One teacher was using it to explore Beowulf with their class, but that span off down. Oh, we've lost Marc. Yeah, that span off down a different path. I found out about therapists had started using it in the controlled environment, specifically efforts by groups like the Bodhana group and the Games to Grow movement. And what I found was they've been using it. That disconnect we've been talking about earlier. Using D&D gave people with social anxiety or problems processing emotional responses, a way to step back from them and experiencing them that step removed, which they were then able to talk about create productively with their therapists. So there was one example of a young man who'd been experiencing, I think he had severe anger issues. It's been a long time since I wrote these articles, so I apologize if I'm forgetting details properly. But what they could do is they could explore he could explore scenarios in his games, and then later his therapist would ask him about them and what he felt about those, how that went, what could have been done differently, and it gave them the language they needed to understand and explore these concepts. And another thing which the Games to Grow movement actually talked about was how it helped with people with social anxiety, because they got to try out different modes of being, different modes of interacting with people. The specific example given was one child with severe social anxiety played the role of a dwarf barbarian who was loud and obnoxious and, elbows on the table,
everything he wasn't,
bang for ale. And the DM would be encouraging them to try and mimic how they believed this dwarf acted at the table, and it gave them a safe space to try out these modes.
I suppose, yeah, it's I guess long been considered a very powerful tool, is the idea of role playing to work through a problem. It's not about me, it's about this character that I just happen to be speaking for this character. Yeah, it's like I said, it's a very powerful tool. I think it's long been acknowledged as very useful for breakthroughs and for depersonalizing, and I know I've found quite useful that the idea of it's not about me, it's about the character, and what would the character do? And when you think about it then later, it's like, maybe I'd have solved it the same way too. Or there's a problem I now have a potential solution for, where it felt a little hopeless before that. The for me, role-playing games in particular are very much about collaborative storytelling, and telling a story as a group. Does that feed into kind of a therapeutic environment, shall we say? Does the idea of telling a story help? Or does it help to allow people that insight we discussed? We'll start with you, Marc.
Yeah, storytelling is something that is almost universal, has been found in every civilization around the world that we go to, and it's a socializing thing, it's a bonding thing, and it does bring people together. I often think of, when I compare tabletop games, I compare the dungeon master's role as to like the director of a community play, and the players are like improvisational actors, and it's that coming together, taking the seed, the kernel of the story, and building it just in the direction of where it is pulled by the characters and their actions together. Something very satisfying and very stimulating about it.
Yeah, I'd agree. Sam, what do you think on that? Like the group storytelling effort, does it contribute towards a therapeutic experience? Is it, should we think of tabletop gaming or computer gaming as a group therapy experience?
Oh, hugely. First of all, a colleague of mine, Dr. Carol Ann North, wrote about this also on the On Tabletop website, about how gaming brings us together, highlighting one particular case of a man who'd experienced severe social isolation and came out of that, and to try and combat that, created a board game to help people who were experiencing that sort of extreme isolation. Speaking personally, the first lockdown for many of us, of course, was hugely isolating. I add on top of that I work night shifts and working remotely, so there was just another level of isolation because I often can't work to other people's schedules. And I started running the Warhammer Fantasy role-playing game for a group of my friends, and creating that story with them, watching how, because we just used the normal starter characters, we just used the ones that the pre-builds, because we were all learning the game together. Watching how they took these characters in response to the scenarios I was giving to them, and knowing that we were making this all together, that helped me with the isolation of those months in lockdown. And even when we weren't able to play, we're only able to play once a month, I'd know it was happening, and I'd be able to go over some of these things, and I'd wonder about what directions the story are going, and that really helped.
That's fantastic. Great, yeah, especially like with the lockdown, you know, the isolation could have been very real. I know my weekly D&D game is a highlight of the week for me, and has been for the last 2 years, so I'm very thankful for it. Quinn, I would ask the same of you, the kind of a group therapy setting with gaming, and I think we're kind of almost naturally falling into a focus of tabletop games, but I guess it applies for computer games as well, would you think?
I would agree that it applies to a lot of computer games. I mean, there's an element of you're not creating your own story in a lot of the big multiplayer games because you're following somebody else's natural inclinations. However, there is definitely something to be said about the collaborative nature, the clans or the teams that you end up following into. World of Warcraft online is possibly one of the biggest ones that everybody is aware of. And I know somebody actually did a study on players' perspectives and the positive impact of video games through forums, and how much one of the things they highlighted was how much the clan and the group of people around them mattered, and how they felt that even though they hadn't met a lot of the people in person, they felt like they were closer to them as friends than they would be if it was somebody they saw every day in school or workplace or any of those. That it really helped to build their confidence, and they gained a lot of well-being from them. And I think that's hugely important. And even going off of the isolation and the lockdown, the National Geographic had a great article on how role-playing games was giving kids a mental health boost when they were falling behind.
That's fantastic.
And
That's really
it gave them something to look forward to, that they could sit with their cousins or classmates when they couldn't go out and play, that they could go to Zoom and Discord and play their own game there.
That's great. Yeah, and again, it's another one. I think obviously the lockdown imposed itself upon the world, so people had to figure it out. Yeah, adapt, or suffer. Unfortunately, just in terms of, I suppose, access to all of these things. I grew up in Mayo in the 1980s. Like, the only thing I'd ever heard about Dungeons and Dragons was the cartoon. The idea that you'd roll dice to play a game was I played Ludo, I played Monopoly, but how do we maybe share access to these sorts of things? I suppose, Marc, you're on a good step there with doing it through the library, which is a wonderful opportunity. How do we go beyond that, do you think?
Well, this is one of the things, and it's one of the barriers that really came up to me when I first started getting tabletop games, or trying to get tabletop games into public libraries, is that if people don't know about it, as you say, if you're growing up and you say to someone, come on, I'd like to play tabletop gaming with people, and they say, what is this? I don't understand what this is. Why are you playing this? What do you win? Are you playing this for money? Are you playing this? Is this a competitive thing? And it is, more than anything, it is the socializing, the collaborative storytelling, this type of thing that you want. It's hard concepts to explain in abstract to people.
Yeah, I agree. And for me, there was still the satanic panic of role-playing games when I was a kid. You know, that was still very much a real thing. But I dare say so many homes now have an Xbox or a PlayStation that you know, games are real in a sense that they are an everyday occurrence. Do we need to maybe give some consideration to, well, should we steer this in some way? And I don't mean to kind of regulate the industry or anything like that, but should we consider gaming as a medium just to be a potential therapeutic tool, or should we talk about the idea of let's make therapeutic games, let's make specific tools that we call a game that is framed as a game but is a therapeutic tool? Is that something that would benefit the world, or is that just too heavy-handed with it? Maybe. What do you think, Sam?
Well, I think that actually is something that would be extremely useful. Games specifically tailored for a therapeutic environment. But and I mentioned that one made by the man who was facing the extreme social isolation, and there are other ones. I think the Games to Grow movement recently fundraised a
Critical Core, I think.
Hmm?
Critical Core, I think, is the name they gave it. Yeah, I think it's based off D&D, but it is their own slightly modified system, as I understand it.
Yeah, specifically to tailored for those needs. Now, you can take any RPG and bring in those adapt it for the therapeutic setting, I think. But having it some specifically tailored for that, I think, is very useful, and something we're actually seeing, at least in like the indie publishing scene, is games that are including some of that language in themselves. I just nipped over and grabbed. Hope my background doesn't immediately mess this up.
No,
Wonder Home.
Wonder Home.
Yeah, which includes all. I'm a magician. Sorry. The danger of giving an ADHD person a background that makes things disappear. Yeah, so Wonder Home includes a lot of that language of inclusivity and conversation and exploration and creating safe environments for players to explore concepts. And that's something I really like seeing.
What about you, Quinn? What do you think on the idea of, should we focus on creating specific therapeutic games as helpers, or should we just look to gaming generally and say we can adapt this?
I think there's value in both. I mean, people are already using, as we've discussed, a lot of role-playing games and even video games as a way of coping themselves and building their own therapy. Therapists are starting to use it as a universal language, but there are also studies being done on therapy-specific based games, and they're finding that it is helping. And oddly, it doesn't matter if you frame it as therapy or as just a game, but people still get the same benefits or lack of benefits if it's not programmed right. One of the big cons I saw in a lot of the therapy or in the papers that I was reading was that video games in particular don't depict mental illness as well. They don't depict how hard life can be for those who are neurodivergent or any of that. And yet, if you create games that center that discussion, it actually engenders a lot of empathy in people, and it brings a lot of inclusivity. And in fact, there's one paper for sexual and gender minority youth, so people who would be on the LGBTQIA plus spectrum, where they created a web accessible game for therapy and to help them, and it was a great success, and they actually think it should be rolled out further. And I think that's a wonderful thing to have, that you have a balance of, if you need support, here are some games you can go to, and if you just want to play a few games, here's some entertainment for you. You know, we don't necessarily need to restrict ourselves to one or the other. I think it's much better if we have a even playing field of everything.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. Marc, what do you think? Given the kind of environment that you're working in, and you're in a library, so there's one would imagine certain protocols to follow. Do you find, is there something specific you felt you were missing that would be really helpful as a tool for your activities with the groups and so on?
The most important thing for us is getting buy-in, I think, from it, both from the public and from the staff and management as well. And it's that educating people about what gaming is, what the benefits are of it, that it is a beneficial activity, and that it's not, the Satanic Panic was a fraud, and that these things aren't going to lead people into shooting sprees. That this is that step removed that Samuel brought up earlier on, that people know, from a very young age, when you're a child and playing cops and robbers in the playground, bang, bang, you're dead. Children know that they're playing a game, and adults know they've grown up with gaming experience. They know that it's a step removed. They are aware that everything they do is playing a game. What you mentioned earlier, that this is what my character is doing. This is not what I'm doing. And it's getting that gaming concept over to people who have forgotten it. It's probably an important thing.
Yeah, I think I'd agree. It's sad to see so many adults sort of lost that ability and desire to seek the simple joy of playing a game of something, whatever that game might be. Just the idea of playing a game. One more thing I wanted to kind of touch on. So I have been seeing a therapist for almost 4 years now, and it has been life-saving for me, in a very real sense. Therapy tends to be guided. There tends to be a therapist and the person receiving it, or the people receiving it, if it's in the group sense. And I personally feel that guidance was an essential part of it. The having a therapist there. The games we're describing, in a tabletop sense, it feels like the DM is now the therapist, and it's been a running joke, I suppose, for years that DMs generally are a part-time therapist to their group of players who are all trying to work out their weird idiosyncrasies and kinks. What do you all think of this being led by a professional trained therapist to lead a gaming session, or is it okay to have somebody who's maybe not, I don't want to say not qualified, or but maybe not quite as prepared perhaps for somebody having a breakthrough and having a total wobble emotionally? What do you think on that, Quinn? What would you think on that?
Well, I mean, people are already starting to use that access already in therapy and other things. Certainly, there's autism camps currently in America that just play D&D, and the therapists are the DMs, and they speak to the kids, and they find that the kids are speaking back to them and going through therapy through the language of the D&D or whatever role-playing games they're playing at the time. And I mean, that is a wonderful thing, but it is something that I think non-therapists and non-professionals need to be aware of, that if you're going into certain games, you may get certain responses that you're not prepared for. I'm hearing a lot of, is it Tales of the Ice Maiden, or one of these that has a lot of really potentially heavy topics that you need to discuss with your players beforehand, so that you know and can use the appropriate safety tools to make sure that their experiences are the best, and you're not ending up as their therapist, that you can go, well, we'll skip over this bit, or maybe we won't even play this particular module, we'll play something else. I think knowing your players' limits and having healthy conversations is a very important part of the game.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that. Yeah, it's hard to argue it. Sam, what would you think on that? The idea of the DM as a therapist, and should they be a qualified therapist?
Well, I don't think any DM should necessarily be a qualified therapist before they start playing.
No.
They put a lock on the DM guide before. You must complete your bachelor's before you can open this. No, I think having a qualified DM as a therapist in those settings is great, but there is that element of that joke about D&D being therapy, but if you're going to bring those elements into the game as a player, communicate with the DM, make sure that they also are happy to explore these elements, because 9 out of 10 times they're not a qualified therapist. So yeah, going into a D&D game thinking I'm going to treat this as therapy to explore my issues without communicating with the DM and making sure that they're safe and happy with that has some serious dangers for everyone involved, both the player and the DM. And
the other players,
all
just to
players,
throw
yeah.
them in, because
Exactly.
it's a group thing.
Exactly, yeah. And the opposite is true, of course, for the DM, as you mentioned, making sure that you communicate what themes the players are happy to explore beforehand. There's a very good video on YouTube, and I wish I could remember the title for it. As you might tell, I'm a bit of a Critical Role fan. And there is a very, very good video breaking down the safety mechanics that they use as examples of safety mechanics that you can bring into your games. And I think that's a very good place to start if you're going to, if anything like that is going to come into your games.
Yeah, it's a good point. I just when we started our current D&D campaign, we as a group, there's just 4 of us playing, including the DM. We as a group sat down and said, right, is there anything anybody doesn't want to kind of broach? Any subject matter that's just not going to be good for you. And it's a great way to start any campaign as a session 0 kind of outline. You say, right, I don't want to talk about this. I might explore something like this. I'm okay with hearing about violence, for example. I'm okay with hearing about, curses, that sort of set the expectations, I suppose, for everyone. Marc, is this something you've run into a lot with the sessions in the library? Do people come with different sort of expectations?
The participants that I've had certainly don't. They come in just to play. We've tried measuring. I have done research into what therapeutic benefits the tabletop gaming has, but really the main thrust of it is that we want to play a game, and these are side benefits that come from it. So we're not doing it specifically as a therapeutic exercise. It's interesting when you're using games as specifically therapy, that schism between, if you're designing a game from the ground up, do you want that designed by perhaps psychological professionals or therapeutic professionals? Do you want that designed by game designers? Do they collaborate? Like, if you think of maybe a weird analogy, the Australian kids band, the Wiggles?
Yes.
They're probably the most successful child's band ever. And the reason is the 4 of them were child psychologists. They met in college while they were studying children's education, but they were awesome musicians. So they formed a rock and roll band, and then after decided to synergize those 2 things. And the whole reason that they're bigger than everyone else in that kind of area of entertainment is because they were able to merge those 2 things. Anything that you want to do that would be successful therapeutic game would probably have to be something similar with those two. 5-minute warning. But I'm going to stop talking and pass this on.
It's all good. It's all good. Yes, I'll be keeping an eye. Yeah, we're coming up on 5 minutes or so. And if there's any questions from the audience that they want to send us our way, now is your opportunity. You're very welcome to do so. I suppose we'll kind of think about wrapping up then. I'll open the floor. Is there anything anyone would like to add in that something they've learned that's interesting, an observation or an insight they've had? The floor is yours.
Well, for myself, looking through a lot of papers, and as everybody has brought it up, satanic panic was a huge thing. And there's been a lot of research papers, in fact, a lot of the research papers from 60s onwards to, I'd say, up until the last couple of years, they've literally been summed up as gamers are people too. In fact, there's one poor soul who had to replicate a study a second time because nobody believes him that gamers could be emotionally stable people. The other fun fact is in the 80s, people used to gather in police stations to play Dungeons and Dragons. And I just found that fascinating. That here, let's all go down to Pierce Street Station and go play ourselves D&D.
I love that idea. I don't know how well we get out with it, but I do love it.
So did I. When I read it in one of the things, I was like, I have to mention that we used to have a much better community with our police.
That's true. Sam or Mark, anything else that you'd like to add in that we haven't touched on yet?
Not really, just to echo what Marc said there. Ultimately, we are coming to these primarily because they're games and we enjoy playing games. And yeah, there are huge benefits to playing these games. I think it boils down to just communication and making sure everyone can have a good time playing.
It's hard to argue that. Mark?
I'd just say thank you, Dav. Thank you, everyone else. Thank you, Octagon, and thank you for everyone joining in.
Well, yeah, I think we're just about at our time. Thank you, folks. I want to say a big thank you to Sam, to Mark, to Quinn, and to our producer, Ryan. If there's anything you would like to plug, folks, now's your opportunity. We'll start with you, Quinn.
Well, as I mentioned at the top of the hour, Cup on Fae has released our 6th short story anthology. You can go to the Cup on Fae channel in the Octagon Discord to hopefully purchase one of them or all of them. We don't mind whichever.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Quinn. Sam?
Well, yeah, at the moment, the 3rd edition of Mag of Holding from Penny Dragon Games is up on Kickstarter. It's the gothic horror themed ones, but it's suitable for Halloween, and I contributed quite a lot to this one. There's my short story Duncranon Belongs to the Dead and my adventure The Payment Due are both in there, along with an article on the staples of gothic horror. And I have a story due out in the dragon-themed anthology Crunchy with Chocolate from Wolfsinger Press, due out later this month. If you find me on Twitter at Pootsydoodle, I will probably shout about this stuff again at some point.
That is the most excellent Twitter handle.
It is a cocktail name. A friend of mine back in Japan used to call me it and made me a cocktail called the Pootsydoodle as a leaving present.
Excellent. You gotta go find out that and have a taste of one of those, I think, yes. And finally, Mark.
I just want to plug that I'm doing a survey on behalf of Fingal Libraries on tabletop gaming in public libraries, something that's going to be coming back in person, and we want to get feedback from gamers about what they require. I'm going to put a link to that into the chat now.
That's great. Thank you so much, Mark. So all that remains then is to say thank you to everyone who's been taking part. Thank you to everyone who's watched. So thank you very much, one and all. We'll talk to you all soon.
Thank you.